Okay, I'd like to read some of the words of Peter Tatchell here from May of 2010. This piece is on his website, petertatchell.net, and it's called Democracy. We've Never Had It So Bad. And the subheading is Britain's first-past-the-post voting system is tantamount to ballot rigging and an echo of 18th century rotten boroughs. So, getting into it, quote, most of the British public are left of centre on most issues. For the last half-century, liberal and left-leaning parties have won a majority of votes in general elections, but often not a majority of seats. This progressive majority in British politics have been cheated out of power over and over again. Thanks to the unfair voting system, the anti-Tory majority have frequently ended up with a minority of MPs. Indeed, every government since the 1950s has taken power based on less than 50% of the popular vote. None has won majority public support at the ballot box. In the 2005 election, Labour won 35% of the vote but bagged 55% of the seats. Of eligible voters, only 22% voted Labour. Yet, with the support of only 1/5 of the electorate, Labour won a 66-seat majority. This is not democracy. It echoes the gerrymandering and ballot rigging of 2 centuries ago, which galvanized the Chartists to campaign for a democratic, representative parliament. The electoral process is rigged. In 2005, if you total all the votes cast for the main parties, it took an average 26,906 votes to elect a Labour MP, 44,373 to elect a Tory MP, and 96,539 votes to elect a Lib Dem MP. Not since the rotten boroughs of the 18th century have elections been so corrupt. This democratic deficit is a direct result of the first-past-the-post system, which allows the election of MPs and governments with minority support. First past the post enabled Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair to win landslide majorities based on popular votes of only 35 to 44%. If there had been a fairer proportional voting system, we would have never had the standalone single-party governments of Margaret Thatcher and John Major, and as a result, never had New Labour and the ditching of socialism under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Recent political history would have been very different. and more progressive. With proportional representation, neither Thatcher and Major nor Blair and Brown would have been able to form governments without the support of other parties. Supported by only a minority of voters and with only a minority of seats, they would have had to form coalitions, which would have almost certainly prevented policy excesses such as the poll tax and the Iraq War. If there had been proportional representation in the 1980s, Thatcher would have had to go into coalition with the Lib Dems and other minor parties, which would have scuppered many of her reactionary policies. Alternatively, Labour might have been able to form a coalition with the Lib Dems and other parties, which would have meant no Conservative government in the 1980s, sparing Britain the social destruction of Thatcherism. Some defenders of first past the post complain that if we switch to proportional representation, Labour might never again win a majority of seats and form a government in its own right. But if Labour can't persuade a majority of voters, it doesn't deserve to form a government. Ditto the Tories. Democracy is supposed to be about the will of the majority. It cannot be reconciled with a voting system that persistently allows parties with minority support to form governments with often huge majorities. He's talking about seats there, by the way, when he says huge majorities. If the last three elections had been conducted under proportional representation, Labour would not have won an overall majority of seats, but there would have been Green MPs and more Lib Dem, SNP and Plaid Cymru MPs. On many issues, these four parties are to the left of the Labour government. If they had been in coalition with Labour since 1997, they would have had a mostly radicalising influence on Blair and Brown, probably resulting in no post office closures, Trident renewal, ID cards, expanded nuclear power, privatisation of public services, and no British troops in Iraq. With proportional representation, the Tories might never rule alone again, thereby preventing a repeat of Thatcherite extremism. We'd be likely to see the election of MPs representing the Greens and possibly radical left parties, as happened under Scotland's proportional representation system. This would shift the political centre leftwards. Labour would be radicalised because it would have to rule in coalition with Green, Left and Liberal Democrat MPs. Despite their flaws, the Lib Dems are more left-leaning than Gordon Brown on most issues. Labour and the Lib Dems could end up more or less permanently in power as the major partners in a new, progressive, traffic light coalition of red, orange and green. This is definitely preferable to having the Tories in government and wielding the knife. A democracy requires a parliament that reflects the people's will. Where the proportion of seats won corresponds to the proportion of votes cast. This means finishing the parliamentary reform process begun by the Chartists. Then Peter talks a bit about the additional member system, which is basically a hybrid voting system used in the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly. Then he finishes this piece by saying, polls show that a majority of people want a fairer electoral system. It would benefit all progressive people and parties, shifting the political consensus leftwards. Whichever party wins the upcoming election, bear in mind this piece was written in May of 2010, before the Tories and the Lib Dems formed a coalition government. The new government should let the people decide by means of a two-stage referendum. First, on whether people want to change the voting system, and second, if they do want change, on what kind of proportional representation system they want. Let me just read that again for purposes of clarification. Whichever party wins the upcoming election, the new government should let the people decide by means of a two-stage referendum. First, on whether people want to change the voting system, and second, if they do want change, on what kind of proportional representation system they want. Until we make the voting system fair, our democracy will remain tainted and flawed, and the progressive majority, liberals, lefts and greens, will often be out of government, even when they have won a majority of the popular vote. So, some interesting points there. I definitely think we could use some electoral reform here in the United Kingdom. One of the big criticisms of the first-past-the-post system is that it encourages tactical voting, which I think is irrefutably true. Tactical voting causes various problems, of course. Personally, I'm not comfortable with tactical voting. It's not something I've ever done or would think about doing in the future. The first-past-the-post system can give a lot of power to the media, which can be very dangerous, of course. And it's a system which can lead people to vote against candidates and parties rather than vote for them. Also, smaller parties tend to get trampled underfoot by the big boys under the first-past-the-post system. So, people's voices are being lost, or drowned out, if you like, which is bad for democracy, surely. Anyway, plenty to think about there, I would hope. Catch you later, folks. Take it easy.